Wangui is just joining us, who's also in Kenya.
Hi, Wangui.
We are ready.
Great.
Now.
Welcome everyone who's here for this Ataya seminar. I'm here in Cape Town in South Africa, and I'm with HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town, and this is our flagship weekly series. Today, we're very honored to have Nyabola as our guest, and I know that a lot of us in the institution are really looking forward to hearing to adopt critical and skeptical and analytic ways of looking at technology, and Nanjala's work is really well suited to that. So Nyabola is a researcher and a writer based in Nairobi, Kenya, and her work focuses on the intersection between technology, media, and society. She has a number of degrees from University of Birmingham, a BA in African Studies and Political Science, 2 MSCs from the University of Oxford, African Studies and Forced Migration, and a JD from Harvard Law School. And she's also worked in numerous research associate positions. She's involved with a number of projects. She's a fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. She's written for a number of high-level publications. And she's the author of Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya, and Traveling While Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move. And the subject of today's seminar looks at the combination of digital rights and languages, African languages, and looking particularly at Kiswahili, which is the most widely spoken African language in the world. And the paper that Nyabola is presenting makes an argument that looking at how African languages and digital rights intersect is not just about that particular language, but serves as a warning or a bellwether for advancing digital rights and protecting the interests of digital citizens in a shared digital future. So, Nyabola, very excited to have you here. Please go ahead. So the way we structure this seminar is about half your presentation and half discussion. So at around 5:30, if you're winding up, we'll switch to discussion.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for HUMA for having me. I'm really excited. I've been attending a couple of the seminars, so of course I'm very excited to be able to present some of my work in progress now. Just to emphasize, it is a work in progress if you've had a look at the paper, and so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes contextualizing the paper, and then a couple of minutes sort of drilling home some of the points that are in the paper, because obviously the point of these workshops is not to just read out the paper, but to actually invite points of discussion. So as you heard, most of my work is at the intersection between technology, politics, and society, and looking at how technology is transforming the way we think about some of the core concepts that define our social lives. And this is an extension of some of that work. So it's particularly looking at the ideas of citizenship and belonging and identity, which I think are foundational to democracy and to political life in all societies. So just really drilling deeper into some of the contextual issues that come up in some of the advocacy and some of the policy work that I've done. So to give you a context of what this paper comes from, in 2019, the government of Kenya announced that it was launching a program known as Huduma Number, which is a digital ID, single source of truth ID document for Kenyans. The process itself had actually been in the work for a number of years and is rooted in reforming Kenya's existing ID system, which is, of course, itself, the Kitambulisho, has a long history that connects it back to colonization and to specific criminalization of young Black malehood in apartheid era in colonial Kenya, which was, of course, an apartheid, a racist state. So the process of reforming the Kitambulisho had been going on since the 80s into the 90s, and there was a proposition in the early 2000s to actually move beyond simply changing the document and creating a digital single source of truth ID. The problem is that there was insufficient public consultation, there was insufficient public coordination, like the people, members of the public were not involved in this process. There were also a number of irregularities with the tendering around who was going to build the system. And people were basically left, the vast majority of Kenyans were left in the dark until February 2019, when the Minister for Internal Security, Fred Matiang'i, announced that we all had 30 days, so between February, the beginning of February and the second day of March, to sign up for this card at the expense of losing access to key government services like renewing driver's license, renewing passports, death certificates, birth certificates. You basically would cease to be a fully functioning Kenyan citizen if you didn't register for this number. Obviously, there are a lot of issues about coercion and rights that have went into that. And there was a great deal of mobilization in civil society and advocacy circles to try and get a legal challenge and a social challenge to this ID card. Thankfully, the legal challenge was somewhat successful. There was a stay. But what really emerged to me as someone who was working both in the advocacy space and in the policy space around this ID number was there wasn't really a mass public mobilization. People didn't understand, A, what the problem is, and B, what they were supposed to do about it. And as an advocate, as an activist, that's a really frustrating position to be, because you want there to be enough public awareness so that when you're responding to an emerging situation, you can move quickly past education to mobilization and to action. We even saw lawyers, people who knew better, who knew that there were significant constitutional violations embedded in the way that the Huduma number was rolled out, standing in line for 6 hours, 8 or however many hours, waiting to get this card that was not grounded in anything except the whims of the state. One thing that really stood out to me, especially in this space, was people trying to do advocacy and mobilization in the general public, where the primary language of social life in Kenya is not English. And you would hear sentences like, ni muhimu kwamba watu wajue huduma namba hailingani na, let's see, ni muhimu kwamba watu wajue kwamba huduma namba ni kitu ambayo haiambatani na privacy yao. And so you would have all of these English words, privacy, data protection, just slotted into Kiswahili language sentences or Shang sentences without any linguistic context and without any social context. And so that was the genesis of this project for me as a person who, as I said, works both in research, in policy, and in advocacy, to try and create some kind of linguistic grounding to the advocacy that was happening around digital rights in Kenya, so that when it comes to mass mobilization for the defense of digital rights, that we have a pre-existing groundwork, a social consciousness on which the subsequent conversations can be built. At the core of this project that's started so I received the Stanford Digital Civil Society Fellowship in December 2020, and the project's been running since January 2021. The core of the project is the creation of the translation of some of these words. And this was work that was done over a number of months with some of the leading Kiswahili language scholars in Kenya and in Tanzania. We translated 52 terms, but some of the words were, there was basically just a small step because there was a pre-existing foundational word. But some of the words were basically created from scratch. And one of my favorite examples is the word for surveillance, because the translation for surveillance that existed in a lot of the popular use in Kiswahili actually doesn't capture that sinister dimension, that what is the intent behind the surveillance. So the existing words that would be used were watching, would translate as watching or looking at. But of course, the intent behind surveillance is what makes it a constitutional violation. It's observing someone, watching someone with the intent to change their behavior, with the intent to influence their behavior. And so these were some of the words that required more than just, putting together what was already in the language, but actually thinking through what is the linguistic context that we want this word to have? What is it that we import that we want it to bring? And that was very successful. So we translated the 52 words and created these flashcards that are available right now that allow people to, we're targeting young people especially, to have on one side the English word and on the other side the Kiswahili translation. But tied to this is also that language is not just words, and language is not just, we provide the translation, but it's also creating popular use for these words. So the project also sponsored a language prize with the Mabati Cornell Prize for Kiswahili writing, which is the biggest language prize, Kiswahili language writing prize. And so this is an award for science and speculative fiction, Kiswahili, encouraging people to use the Kiswahili translations and giving them, creating stories that people will enjoy reading using these new terms. There's also an educational aspect, which is, again, as I said, grounded in the idea of consciousness raising and the circles of consciousness, whereby we're providing a curriculum for young people especially. Remember that Kenya is a very young country. Over 60% of our population is under the age of 35. Giving them materials that they can use to talk about amongst each other, to talk about digital rights, to be aware of the digital rights and what they can do to defend them. And then there's the last piece, which is publishing. And that is the anthology of short stories, articles in newspapers about technology and digital rights, and also this paper. So academic articles that sort of provide the theoretical context for why this work is important and why it has to happen now. So with that context in mind, this paper spent a lot of time trying to give a lay of the land of what Kiswahili represents. And Kiswahili is a very complicated language with an interesting history. It is the most widely spoken African language in the world. There are other languages that have more speakers, for example, Amharic, just because the population of Ethiopia and Eritrea together is much larger than the populations of the Kiswahili language communities, but it is spoken in more countries than any other language in Africa. It is the only African language that is an official language of the African Union, which gives it significant cultural import or importance. Kiswahili the Swahili people exist. And this is something that Mazrui spends a lot of time engaging with, partly because he was Swahili, and this is something that was really interesting to him, that for a long time in the academic research about Kiswahili, and I found a number of papers that asserted that Kiswahili was a language that didn't have native speakers. And part of the issue is that Kiswahili is a product of a lot of cultural fusion that happens on the coast. And so the Swahili people were not recognized as a distinct people, and were often put in other ethnic groups. So there would be Bajuni, and there would be Giriama, and there would be all of these other smaller language families. But actually, the Swahili people do exist, and they are their culture. It's a distinct culture that is born of Arab influence, that is born of Bantu influence at the coast, but also, very, very small extent, Portuguese influence because of the Portuguese and the Indian Ocean slave trade that happened. The Arab Arab trade influence is a big reason of why Kiswahili became more commonly spoken in the African hinterland. And of course, that creates a contentious history. A couple of years ago, I guest edited a series of essays for African Arguments, and we had a fascinating essay from LCA Akuze, who is a Tanzanian journalist, who was talking about resistance to Kiswahili language in the Tanzanian hinterland, that for a lot of older Tanzanian people, Kiswahili was a language of imperialism, but not European imperialism, but Arab expansionism. And so there was historically this resistance, and there's traces of it still, that this language does not represent willingness, like people didn't take it up willingly, but actually has a history that's associated with force. But it's also associated organically with trade and with people moving all the way until the east coast of the DRC to conduct this long distance trade that also feeds into the Indian Ocean trade, all the way to China, all the way to of course, to India. The two main colonial powers in East Africa, and so I'm leaving Belgium out of this, the two main colonial powers in East Africa, Germany and Britain, both had a policy of making Kiswahili the official language of the colonies that they governed. And of course, again, as I said, this engendered a kind of resistance in a lot of communities, because it was not an organic uptake, but rather reflected this vision of a unitary African identity, which could be reorganized according to the whims of power. And I think in my theory, and this is something that I put in the paper, and I think a lot of linguists, Chege Gidiora also writes a little bit about this, is that it creates a cognitive resistance to the language. A lot of us, when we speak Kiswahili, there's a formal register, the academic register of Kiswahili, and there's an informal register of Kiswahili, which often ignores all of the language's rules, all of the language's structures, to make it something that makes sense for the day-to-day use. So formal Kiswahili is very difficult. And any Kenyan will tell you it's not something that is it's not something that's very easy to pick up, and it's not something that's very easy to make malleable, in part because of this bifurcation between how people speak and how people think people should speak. So on the upside, there is a formal structure for the promotion of Kiswahili. There are very many institutes across East Africa that are charged with promoting Kiswahili and moving the language forward. But on the other hand, the organic use, there's a friction there that I argue is rooted in this historical relation with force or relation with imposition. And Chege Gadiora writes beautifully about Sheng and how Sheng emerges in Kenya, especially as a kind of manifestation of this resistance. That Sheng is the language of youth culture. Sheng is the language of resistance. And it's interesting that Sheng has such a contested history, but everybody speaks it, and its popularity almost cannot be constrained. In the paper, I write a little bit about the analogies between Sheng and its relationship with youth culture and digitalization and its relationship with youth culture. As I've mentioned, this is a very young region in the world, and a lot of people who are, for example, going to vote in the 2022 election don't remember what the world was like before there was internet. And so there's this intimate connection between digitalization in the region and this language that represents everything that it is, rebellion, rejection of authority, rejection of power, and keeping a generational divide between the young and the older. The emergence of Sheng in Kenya identifies urban youth as a distinct community of practice, and community of practice is a group of people who share a common mutual endeavor. It's not clear, this is a formulation that comes from Chege Gidiora, it's not clear what the common endeavor is for young people except to resist authority and to resist, I guess, generational shifts. But the underlying idea is that Sheng speaks to the socioeconomic concerns of a young population that is marginalized from power, that is removed from, that is unable to participate in the typical markers of maturity that existed historically and that exists in modern times. So you're not going through the rites of passage that your parents would have gone through, or even your grandparents would have gone through, and you're kind of in the process of inventing your own rites of passage. And Sheng is the language that represents this community of practice. But this is what's really interesting, is that Sheng is not the language of digitalization in East Africa. It's not even the language of digitalization in Kenya. There have been some efforts. Sheng Nation, which is one of the collaborators that we worked with on the translation project, is an initiative that provides digital content in Sheng, translates keywords in Sheng, and we actually had them in the room so that we could think through what would some of these words be like in Sheng. But its uptake has been, on the digital space, has been slow. There are people who do use it and who do use it as their primary language of communication. But for example, the translation apps that we use, Google Translate, or even the translations that are embedded in sites like Twitter or Facebook, don't know the difference between Sheng and Kiswahili. They can't distinguish between the lexical structures of the two languages, even though any Kenyan who speaks both Sheng and Kiswahili would be able to tell when one person is using one and the other. And this I connect to my idea of why digitalization and what's happening, how the African digital public sphere is being organized is actually it's something that's being given to us from the outside that doesn't necessarily reflect our priorities and our interests, and is kind of deepening this gap between our ability to use the internet and our ability to articulate ourselves and to present ourselves and to organize ourselves on the internet the way we would organically in the analog public sphere. I think this an inability to see Sheng, and I use in the paper De Sousa Santos ideas of sociologies of absence, that the inability to see Sheng and to understand Sheng and to handle Sheng and to process Sheng is a symbol of something else, that's something deeper that's happening, which is that the internet assumes that the end user, the people who are interfacing with the internet, are English speaking. It's only recently that they've stopped assuming that they were English speaking white men from Silicon Valley. Right now, we at least have a recognition that there is a huge internet use in China and other parts of the world, but still when it comes to Africa, we haven't gotten to the point where we're building technology with an end user in mind, who is an African, whose organic, whose first language and whose language of primary use is not English. And this matters a great deal, as I said in my abstract, because of the ways in which our governments are moving online. Right now in Kenya, because of the government's digitalization policies, you have to use the internet for paying your taxes, getting a driver's license, getting a passport, registering births or deaths. Everything is shifting to this digital first culture, but the digital first content that's being produced by the government itself, but also by people, not very rarely exists in Kiswahili and almost never exists in Sheng. What does that do for our ability to shape the public sphere, to demand our rights, to articulate our identities online? As is intimately connected to the capacities of the digital citizen. Language is intimately connected to our capacity to participate in the public sphere. And especially where rights and the idea of rights are grounded in norms and practices rather than in law, you can pass all the laws that you want, but a digital public sphere is not necessarily shaped by legal considerations. This is why we can't, for example, enforce laws about assault or threats, intimidation, all the things that happen, all the kinds of violence that exist online, for which there are laws that exist in the analog space. But we have such a hard time imposing them in the digital space because as it stands, digital citizenship is primarily defined by norms and is primarily defined by user agreements that we sign with the corporations. It's the corporations that will decide what kind of action will be taken if these norms are violated. So the ability to understand the terms of use, to articulate the norms, to participate in the norm building and the norm formation is intimately connected to language and therefore intimately connected to our capacities as digital citizens. Language also shapes the size and scope of who we think our digital public spheres are. And I write a little bit in the paper about code switching and how code switching is such an integral part of being an African digital citizen, of participating in digital spaces. Very briefly, I think everybody knows what code switching is, although I think the linguistic definition of code switching is slightly different from the one that currently exists in popular culture. But at its heart, it's that the average African speaks at least 3 languages, if not more. You have your index language, which is your mother language, the language that which is most often your mother language, which is the language that's spoken at home. You have a widely spoken African language. So in East Africa, that would be Kiswahili. I think in South Africa, you have out of the 11 languages, I think 9 of them are African languages. And then you would have your language of European contact. So it would be English, French, Portuguese, whatever. So the average educated African person is trilingual. And anybody who speaks multiple languages then will switch between, and this is what code switching is, will pick and choose basically between those 3 languages in different social contexts, depending on what it is that they're trying to convey. So just as a completely anecdotal example, in my case, if I'm trying to say something about the situation in Kenya, and I don't want the people who follow me on Twitter in Europe to understand what I'm saying, I will say it in Kiswahili or I'll say it in Sheng. More specifically, in the context of hate speech, in the context of, and please don't take this as me saying that mother languages necessarily must be related to violence, but this happens a lot in the context of hate speech and dissemination of hate speech, where people will switch to mother languages in order to speak to an inside group and exclude outside groups. And this is partly what code switching does. So language is integral to shaping the size and scope of our audiences. We are doing something when we switch between languages, when we borrow from other languages, because there are things that one language can do and can communicate that another language cannot. And code switching is how Africans use the internet. We get mad in Kenya sometimes because some of the South African tweets start off in English and they switch to another language, like, oh, I want to hear the end of that joke. But there's something that's being done there because the joke only works if you understand the double entendre that exists in isiZulu, in isiXhosa or whatever. So that's the second thing. The third one is language can also be a marker of citizenship. That speaking a specific language can actually also correlate directly to which digital publics we belong to and which analog publics we belong to. And this is correlated to the idea of language policies, that some countries, and this is in the analog space, to be considered a citizen in Japan, for example, speaking Japanese is a prerequisite. To be considered a citizen in the Czech Republic, speaking Czech used to be, it's not so much anymore, a prerequisite. Given that digital publics are shaped primarily by norms and are shaped primarily not necessarily by hard and fast rules, you'll see norms of inclusion and exclusion coming out when and informal language policies that exist within certain digital publics that determine digital citizenship. And anybody who isn't able to at least understand Kiswahili fully participate in Kenyan, Tanzanian digital publics, or consider themselves a digital citizen of the publics that are defined by the Kenyan internet users. And this, especially when you're thinking about at the Pan-African level, the switching between various European languages of European contacts is also something that you see when people are trying to, when Tanzanians are having conversations about Magufuli and transformation in Kiswahili, because the primary audience is Kiswahili, but recognizing, for example, during the emergency of the internet shutdown, that there was a need to bring more people in the region together to understand what was happening, shifting to English and even sometimes shifting to French in order to make it a more Pan-African conversation. And this ties into the last point about the question of language and digital rights, which is language as a factor of digital exclusion. And this is the overall thesis of the paper, I think, that the inability of many of the tools that we use in technological tools that we use to see African languages, even a language like Kiswahili, is a factor in the ways in which African language communities are being excluded from developments in the digital space, and specifically my interest in digital rights. Again, this is an anecdotal example, but for example, there is no, what's it called? Predictive text, and Samsung phones don't have predictive text in Kiswahili. So you can type it in English, but if you're using the dictionary, it often means that your English dictionary is learning Kiswahili words, and sometimes you're not going to want to use the Kiswahili word. You're going to want to use the English word, but it's not going to be able to identify the English word. The more your predictive text learns that this word is correct, then it stops marking it as an error, which is happening to a lot of phone users right now, because Kiswahili, again, the most widely spoken African language, isn't represented in some of the tech that's being developed. Some of the some projects are trying to do this. There are projects that people who have been in touch who are doing natural language processing and all these various initiatives trying to get these translation apps up. But my overall sentiment in this space is that it's not just about the technology that needs to be built, it's also about a mindset that needs to shift. Who do we assume is going to buy a Samsung phone? Who do we assume is going to use these language translation tools? Who's going to use them, not even just for translation, but also for preservation? And the shifting that assumption, I think, of who the internet user is and what they're using the internet for, I think is a critical part of digital inclusion and bringing more African language communities online. So all of which is to say that, there's something I think that we all suspect, and I think it's something that we all feel, but I wanted to take time with this paper to articulate it clearly, especially for the communities that build technology, use technology, and advocate for technology, that language is important. And African languages have to be represented in our shared imagination of digital futures, what we want the digital futures to look like. And it's not just about providing translation, because again, translation assumes that we want to bring people into conversations rather than wanting to be in conversation with each other. It's about making room for a different kind of internet future that builds with the assumption that we are multilingual, we exist in various digital publics, and we want to be able to move comfortably and seamlessly between those digital publics. So that's the theory that I'm trying to put together with this paper, and I'm excited to take your questions. I've just hit my time mark. I'm excited to take your questions and to hear more about what you have to say about that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nyabola. That was great. I think some of the issues you raise around just looking at the language for a start, around that tension between formalization of language and organic growth of language, looking at Sheng as coming up from people's experience. And it makes me think of just rough general knowledge of, say, French, which also has, Dominique, who's here, one of my colleagues will know more, but the institutes to formulate words so that English words aren't used in when new words appear. I'm also thinking of Afrikaans in South Africa, which is, has majority Dutch roots, but also has Malay and indigenous languages in it, and was also formalized sometime in the last 100 years. Also, Hebrew and Irish are really interesting examples because they were also recovered, and they weren't necessarily lived languages, but they were recovered and became lived languages. So I think that's really, I find that really inspiring, that actually formal projects can recapture something and then a language becomes a lived language. So I think there's kind of examples there.
Yeah, and I wanted to add something actually that I didn't mention. The idea behind this project is that Kiswahili is an example that can, who want to also do this kind of initiative with Somali, which is also another language that has, Somali was not written before, I think it was 1970. It was a project of Said Barre. And it's a very funny story. I don't know if it's, but this is how it was told to me, that one day Said Barre gathered all of the leading scholars of Swahili language into a room and gave them a bunch of typewriters and told them that they had to create an orthography for Somali in 2 weeks or he would kill them all. But Somali wasn't written before the 70s. And so there's also an interest in this sort of project to try and help the language remain current. And it's starting off with the big languages in the hope that the smaller languages can also have a little bit more room to participate. If Kiswahili does not have these words, and if Kiswahili doesn't have this interest, what does it mean for Dorobo, or Dorobo is, I guess, is a Swahili language, but smaller languages that still hides, but don't have the critical numbers to be able to say, hey, we also want to participate in digital conversations. Kiswahili is a Bantu language. It's a Bantu language. The Bantu language family is the largest language family in Africa. So the idea is that it can be a snowballing effect that allows us to maybe do this with isiZulu and maybe bring in, all these other languages that are related at a very base level.
Yeah. No, yeah, the Bantu language group, stretching down from where you are down to us. I mean, I was a speaker on Sahara Sparks in Dar es Salaam in 2019, the tech conference, and I also went there with the uncertainty of whether Kiswahili was a lingua franca or whether they were mother tongue speakers. And so, of course, I learned that, as you've said, it is a mother tongue as well. And I'm going to invite people to raise their hands and ask questions. And in the meantime, I'll just ask you about one more thing, which is you used this example of the word for surveillance that you formulated as one of the words. and how it captured the more sinister aspects of surveillance. And if you could recount that, and maybe what I'm interested in is what's the mechanism by which you are arriving at the words? You know, how is it done?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm looking for, there it is. It's on the top of my stack because I've been writing about it for a while now. So the practical terms of what we did was we reached, Kiswahili has, as I mentioned in the paper, multiple dialects, and spoken Kiswahili has multiple dialects. And the main dialect that's taught, the main version that's taught in school is based on one dialect, which is called Kiunguja, which comes from Zanzibar. But they make a lot of adjustments to it depending on whether the word carries over or whether there is already a pre-existing term, etc. So what was really important in gathering the scholars was getting that linguistic representation. So not just having academics from the University of Nairobi who teach and speak fluent Kiunguja, but also having representations from the Kenyan coast and having representation from both mainland Tanzania and the coast of Tanzania. And we started very tech-based, had a WhatsApp group over 5 weeks. I created the list of key terms and you populated it with the English translations, the English translations that are here, and distributed it to the different academics. And we had a WhatsApp group and we would deliberate over the WhatsApp group over many, many days. And the idea was basically that the words that we agreed upon, we would just sort of move forward with, but the words that we had some kind of contention about is what we would take into the workshop. So then we had a workshop. It was a 5-hour marathon. And the principles were very simple, that we wanted words that people would use. So there is a tendency in Kiswahili and also in French, at the Academy in French, to take the most complicated version of the word because obviously complexity is a marker of fluency. But the idea behind this was to make words that people would use. So whatever word we were proposing, we would take the simplest version where it was possible. We would, if there was an existing word that would provide a root, we would build on that root. So bringing in a new word completely was a last resort. If there was a pre-existing word, there is a dictionary called the Kiputiputi Dictionary for Computer, which is only published in Tanzania. But if there was a pre-existing word, then we would sort of adapt that word rather than have something completely new. Those were the core principles. And so the surveillance word is actually an excellent example because the translation for surveillance in Kiswahili before we did this project didn't exist. There were, wherever it was used in the text, as I said, it was watching, looking at, but it never really conveyed the sinister aspect of surveillance, which is the intent. Why are they watching you? Why are they monitoring your communications? Why are they, intercepting your communications? And so the translation that we provided here in English was the guiding principle, guiding framework. So we start with that observation from a distance by means of electronic equipment, for the purpose of influencing, managing, and directing. Then we translated that description into Kiswahili and then got into the word. There's a Kiswahili, the excellent thing about Kiswahili is that it's a very malleable language, and the root pieces of Kiswahili are often syllables. Just single 2-letter, 3-letter combinations that can be adapted to change the grammar, to change the tense, to change, the mood. Is it subjunctive? Is it indicative? Is it imperative? Just changing one letter changes the entire word. So there's a word in Kiswahili called kudoya, which doesn't really have an English translation, but kudoya in Kiswahili and in Sheng, it means to look at someone's food or someone's clothing or someone's house, to covet it. It's basically to covet with the intent of acquiring it for yourself.
Yeah.
So we found this root word and we were like, can we do something with this root word? And the word that we settled on is udukizi. Ujukizi, the etymology is in Kudoya, because it is to look at with an intent. It's to look at with, to indicate that I'm not just watching you, but I want to do something with this information once I collect it. So yeah, that's just one example.
A covetous gaze. Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to, I think what I'll try out here is that we have three people with questions. And so what I think we may do is take 3 questions, and then you'll have 3 to respond to rather than 1 at a time, just to use the time well. So if each of you could first, Kaguro, and if it's possible for you to put on video when you ask a question, then that's great. If not, then no worries. But yeah, please feel free to speak.
Hi, Nyabola.
Hi.
Right. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. Hi. Okay. So thank you for the paper and the presentation. I'm very tempted to say mine is more of a comment, but I will not. I was thinking about your use of Sheng, the idea of Sheng, and how I remember Sheng spreading, which was through popular culture, right? Sheng is very much Matatu culture, right? It's very much, it spreads through the city and it spreads through Nairobi, through transport, right? So I'm wondering about how you think about digital rights and providing a sort of digital vernacular using popular culture. So TikToks, obviously, but obviously also through music. I'm thinking about Joyce Nyairo's work and the idea of just how ideas spread through Kenya and how practices spread through Kenya to transform ways through popular. So music, videos, that kind of stuff. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kaguro. And Claire, if you would like to ask.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the chance to ask a question. I'm wondering whether there's a correlation between language and a region's competitiveness in the global market, because I think there are many areas or multiple areas where developing countries are excluded in the global economy, and as a result, their languages are invisible. And how might we then navigate this conundrum given the state of affairs? And my second question is, it's okay to talk about, the gaps between language, but when thinking about addressing these linguistic gaps, what processes might be required in data science and product development, and what might be the ethical considerations important for this process?
Great. Thank you to my colleague, Claire. And now Wangui, also a fellow researcher at Huma.
Hi, karibu sana our sister Nyabola. Hi, karibu. My question in some ways is, it builds on a bit of what you're saying and also Kaguro. And I hope I didn't do something because I had to see my kid, but I think the resistance to Sheng is not, in digital spaces and in also vernacular used to talk about, for example, Huduma number, is also to the bodies who speak Sheng. So because Swahili is really invested in, or the Swahili we're told to speak or to write in inshas, in school, in essays, is really invested in this bid to create a proper subject, but Sheng is spoken by people, and Shege talks about this, who are not the ideal liberals. And I think that resistance is not just in digital spaces. There was a time when there's always moral panic in the newspaper where someone is always like, these youth, they can't even speak English, proper Swahili, they write bastardized Sheng in their essays. Happened. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that resistance, not just in digital spaces, not just in Google, but also how that that resistance to both the bodies who speak Sheng, but translates to these other spaces. So that localized resistance then is further translated into these digital spaces.
Thank you. Thank you, Wangui. So yeah, Nyabola, if you would like to respond to those 3 points, you could combine them, respond to them separately, however you'd like to.
Sure. I'll just take them one by one. One of the things that I tried to, well, actually, I think they're connected. I tried to really touch on it, but obviously not knowing how deeply to be able to get into it so that it doesn't lose sight of it. But I agree completely. There's a connection between Sheng and popular culture being working class culture and poor culture in Kenya that is kind of connected. And this is one of the reasons why I spent a little bit of time pointing out that as much as I'd like to speak Kiswahili, and I recognize that it's a language of significant import, it does have a history. Language, it has a history that is connected to force, that is connected to imperialism, that is connected to class, that is connected to exclusion. And so I think, I mean, I agree completely. I think that you know, our generation, we've lived through the moral panics, the banning of the Sheng books, the banning of the speaking Sheng in schools, students being punished for it. And I think it's part of the reason why, for me personally, for this project, I included the Sheng nation into the project, because it is part of that. And this goes to your question, Kagura, of that next stage. Okay, how do we make words that people will use, and how do we make them in a format that people will find appealing and find useful? You know, it's very notable that the funding to make this project work didn't come from Africa. It came from Stanford. It came from the United States. And I touched a little bit about this in the paper. With digital humanities specifically, but with digital research generally, my experience in this space has been that the funding streams are only just opening up. That for a long time, the priorities of digital research policy in Africa were being determined elsewhere, and we were reacting. And so this Huduma number is an excellent example of this, because the Huduma number is actually connected to World Bank ID4D, which is one of the biggest funding streams for digitalization around the world. ID4D is an initiative to make digital IDs across the world, to standardize digital IDs across the world, collect all of this biometric data. And specifically, one of the key intents of the ID4D initiative is to turn poor people into consumers of certain material goods. So digital wallets, to make it easier for money to flow in poor countries, because that's a friction that they argue is making development difficult. I don't agree with that theory at all. So this is the underlying tension, and this is another reason why I wanted to write this paper and write it as an academic paper, because it's important to open up these lines of inquiry and to interrogate some of these questions that you've put on the table. Why is it that we're not building apps in Sheng? Why is it that even when Kenyans build apps, they build them in Kiswahili, in English first, and then only think about Sheng later? Why doesn't Jumia have a Kiswahili interface? Why doesn't OLX have a Kiswahili interface? There's something there about presentability, class mobility, who is the ideal citizen, who is the good citizen, what language do they speak and how do they present in public, that I think, and I point this out in the paper, is connected to coloniality and this whole idea of finding acceptance under the colonial and finding to the second question about the correlation between languages and global market, I mean, I think Mandarin is an excellent example of this, that, you know, 30 years ago, the idea that there would be Confucius centers all across Africa teaching kids Mandarin would have been completely incomprehensible. And the rise of China as an economic power, as a political power in Africa, has completely turned that logic on its head. And now Mandarin is one in Africa. So, and historically also, you know, as I mentioned, the popularity of Kiswahili is not just because the Swahili speakers are one of the smallest language families in the region. It is a commercial language. It is because the Arab population, the Swahili people on the coast of Kenya, were an economically important community. In Kenya and in Tanzania, Zanzibar was the capital of the Sultanate of Oman, right? It was such a prosperous part of the Sultanate because of the spice trade that they moved their capital from Oman to Zanzibar. In both countries, the British and the German colonizing forces did not actually colonize the Swahili-speaking regions. They were administered as protectorates. So Mombasa, Malindi, all of the Kenyan coast didn't become part of Kenya formally until the last days of colonization, the 60s, 50s. Zanzibar, and between Zanzibar and Tanganyika. So there's something there about the economies of the community, the economic dimension that is still happening today and is still affecting digitalization. Does that mean that it's not important to do this work in African languages? Absolutely not. Because I think one thing that's happening right now, and this is one of the first assertions that I make in the paper, the tech utopianism that did not think about the social dimension, of what is making us, of how tech is changing us, I think is ending. I think we are realizing that some hard work to go into defining our tech futures. That assuming that has crumbled of what the internet should begin to fray and begin to fall apart. So there is room for making the demand that the hard work of language translation, of shifting ideas of language needs to happen. Otherwise, going to a point of inflection that we can't with recovering democracy when the horse is bolted from the stable. It's going to be the same with what processes might be built to do this. I'm not a techie. I don't know. Oh, sorry. I'm being told I'm breaking up.
I think I don't know. Audio is,
I mean,
your audio is not too bad, but the video is sticking a bit.
Okay. Anyway, that was my answer. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know.
We can hear,
I think I'll leave that to the techies.
So we have time for one. We have time for one more question, which is coming from Divine, and Divine is asking: is there a power and a strategy to not being part of the digital? That is operating outside or on the margins of the digital, and then that is to tech or not to tech. And yeah, I wonder if you might try switching off your video, Nyabola. You might make it.
All the opinion. Test 1 2 1 2. Yeah. Test 1 2 1 2.
That's good. That's good. I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. This is a question that I grapple with, and my opinion is that everybody who doesn't want to be part opt out. I think the challenge that we have is that policymakers and powerful people operate from an assumption inevitability, that the internet is an inevitable part of our future. I don't necessarily think that that's true. I think that people, communities who want to be part of it should be able to opt out. For example, 1990s, because they didn't think it was important for them. And at the time, everybody thought, oh, it's archaic and it's difficult and it's or whatever. But in retrospect, people, the realization was that it made sense for their particular social context. China is a small country, etc. So I think that anybody who wants to opt, and this is one of the criticisms that I have for digital first government. as is being imposed everywhere, again, who, oh no.
Hey, Nyabola.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Test,
I know.
test, 1, 2,
You
1,
are.
2.
We can hear you. I think you mentioned that you had 2 connections you could choose between. So maybe, I don't know if the other one would be better, just for the closing part of the seminar.
Test, 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 test. 1, 2. Is
I
that
can hear you.
better? Okay, so I've switched.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so example, the United Kingdom has a digital first strategy that they've had in place for a number of years. And a recent review of that digital first strategy by there's a charity that did this review, found that it makes no accommodations for people with disabilities. It makes no accommodations for people who don't have regular access to the internet. It makes no accommodations for poor people who their primary connection with the internet is their local library, which means that they're not available after certain hours. They're not able to connect to the internet after certain times of the day. There are still millions of people around the world. And I think this pandemic has really driven the point home as schools, universities, everything has tried to move online. There are still millions of people, maybe even billions of people around the world for whom digital first government simply doesn't make sense. And so in the broader scheme of things, I'm absolutely of the opinion that anybody who wants to opt out, anybody who is unable to, is unwilling to, should be able to opt out. This paper really operates from the position of, okay, for those people for whom we are building this space for, how do we make this more habitable? How do we make this more inclusive? And I think right now, as I said in the beginning, that our assumption of who the end user is conditioned by a lot of exclusion. The person who we assume is going to use the internet, the English-speaking man usually from a rich Western country, it simply does not hold true. It's worth interrogating, and this language is one of the entry points of doing that interrogation.
Thank you very much, Nyabola. That's a great summing up of your presentation. And yeah, I think that to refer back to your paper, when you talk about the tension between the idea of a digital civic space and the fact that this space is determined by commercial companies and private companies, puts up an inherent tension there.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I don't know if you'd like to try switching on your video just for the last, just for the goodbyes and the thank yous.
All right, let's try it.
There you are. Okay. So thank you again so much for joining us. And thank you to my colleagues and my department, HUMA. You've been listening to an entire seminar hosted by HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. And today's guest was Nyabola. Thank you very much for informing us, and we've really enjoyed having you here.
Thank you for having me. Great pleasure. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
I'll go in the chat before I log out.
Sure.